Assalamu alaikum warahmatullah. Web Design and Development lecture number 4. In this lecture we are discussing about web application architectures. This lecture will consist of web architecture basics, and we will study two kinds of architectures: client server architecture and the layered architecture. Let's define what a system architecture is. The architecture of a computer system is a high level, most general design in which system is based. Architectural features include components, collaboration, and connectors. Components are actually parts of your application. Collaboration means how these components interact with each other, and connectors show how components communicate with one another. Architecture actually describes the structure, forms forms the transition from analysis to implementation. It provides the different viewpoints. It can provide the conceptual viewpoint, a runtime, process, and implementation viewpoint, and it makes the system understandable. Architecture is actually helpful in communication between the team members, that how your system is actually composed of components and how it will communicate, how each component will communicate with one another, and how runtime processes will look like, and how implementation is carried out from the analysis phase to the implementation phase. Several architectures for specific requirements in application domains have been developed. For web application architectures, we usually consider two types of concepts: the layering aspects and the data aspects. The layering aspect refers to the implementation of the principle of separations of concerns. That means your application should have different or a number of layers that have been separated from each other, and each layer performs a specific designated task. In terms of data aspects, to support the processing of structured and non-structured data, you can layer your system in terms of data with some kind of structured and non-structured data. You can use layer to deal with one kind of data and another layer with the other kind of data. There are a number of factors that actually affect the overall architecture of your application. The first requirement is functional requirement. You must consider the number of clients and the number of users and the types of the client and the other stakeholders. And you must also consider the functional requirements of each kind of user. For example, if the user require a centralized access, you can use a client server architecture. However, if there are number of roles and responsibilities for users or clients, you can use some other kind of layering architecture. Another important affecting factor is quality consideration, such as performance, scalability, reusability, and other. In terms of selecting architecture with best performance that provides high scalability and reusability, it actually depends on the type of application and your choice of architecture. So if you want to improve the performance, scalability, and reusability of your architecture or your application, you should use an architecture which provides separation of concern, and it can be easily migrated, or new features can be easily added without actually requiring the redesign of your application. So a layering architecture is very helpful to provide scalability and reusability. It can also improve the performance and other quality consideration of your application. You must also consider the technical aspects. For example, the operating system you are working on, what kind of middleware application you have to deal with. Your architecture must be compatible with the legacy system, such as an old system that has been developed in the client server architecture or layer architecture. Your new or decision of architecture must consider such requirements so that your new application can be incorporated with ease. And you also have to consider the experience of your development team with the existing architectures, the patterns, and the project management. So if your team is able to handle or manage such technicalities, you can decide which architecture you want to employ in your web application. There are certain particular components of architecture that defines the components. For example, client is one of the basic component. It is usually a user agent. It is can be a browser that is controlled by the user to operate the web application. It is provides the functionality that can be expanded by installing plugins. So client is an end user of your application. So it is a most fundamental part of an architecture. Another component is a firewall that provides actually a secure communication from insecure network to a secure network, such as it provides a regulating the communication between internet and the corporate local area networks. Communication is often filtered by access rules. Some architectures use a proxy uh, that temporarily stores the web application or web pages in a cache. Web servers are also an important part of your architecture. Web server component actually is a software that supports the various web application protocols such as hypertext transmission protocol or its secure version, etc., to process the client requests. There can be certain kind of servers such as database server. This component deals with the supply of the data and in the structured form, i.e. in the tables. Legacy application, there can be some older system that should be integrated as an internal or external component that can also be a part of your architecture. There can be a media server. This component is primarily used to content streaming of non-structured or bulk of data such as audio or videos or files. There can be an application server which holds up functionality required by several applications. So here is a diagram of a typical architecture. It involves the major components such as a client which has a browser and can be integrated with some plugins to increase the functionality of your application. Your local area network is protected by a firewall, and it actually manages the access from a local area network to a internet server. There can be a proxy. Proxy is used to actually cache the data from the server, and it provides the fast access to the client. If the data is not available in the proxy, you can access the data from the web server. A typical web server contains the XML pages and the content and the graphic integration support. It is our web server is also linked with other servers such as database server, application server, or some legacy application, and it also can be connected to media server depending upon the need of each kind of server. So these components are actually can be used in any manner. If one of them is not required, you can simply remove from the architecture components. So usually the web architectures are described in layers. The typical layers are presentation layer, application layer, and the data layer. Presentation layer deals with the application that needs to communicate with the external entities such as humans, users, and computers. and it is implemented using a graphical user interface. It deals with the front of your application where you interact with the web application. The application deals with the data processing such as business logic, calculation, services. It means all the application code is placed in the application tier. The another layer, important layer, is the data layer. Data can reside in databases or other information repositories. It deals with the implementation of different data sources of information system. So, a most commonly used architecture is a two-layer architecture, often referred as client-server architecture. So, layer 1 consists of client platform hosting a web browser, and layer 2 consists of server platform hosting all the server software components. That means you have integrated all the components in one server such as web app server, services, dynamic HTML pages and databases into a single entity, and these entities are merged to serve the clients requesting to perform a specific task. So client server actually, the clients directly send request to the server and server responds to the client request. It has certain advantages such as it can be very easy to establish, and it is very inexpensive. Single platform has 10 to 100 users can be incorporated in such architecture very easily. So it also has certain disadvantages such as it is very interdependent. That means all the services, databases and web app server communications are all dependent on one server. If any of the uh, if you want to reuse any of the component, it is very difficult to use in another application. So there is a high coupling of components. There is limited scalability. For example, if you want to integrate or add another service, it will be very difficult to manage its integration with the existing server. And it is also useful for only small companies or organizations. So if you have a requirement with very limited users and you do not want to actually enhance the application in the future, so you have limited budget, so you can use this architecture to build your web applications. Three-layer architecture is very common in web applications. The layer 1 deals with the data, the layer 2 deals with the presentation, and layer 3 deals with the applications. So it similarly, it has a client, it has a firewall, and it has a proxy. And the first layer, it deals with the web server, is the presentation layer. Actually, this is sequenced in the wrong manner. Layer 1 deals with the presentation of your web application. It actually deals with the actual graphical user interface. The layer 2 is the business layer that deals with the application server. It also contains the business logic, connectors, personalization, data access, etc. It can also be integrated with the backend, legacy application, or enterprise information system. The third layer deals with the data of the application, and it usually contains a database management system. So whenever a request is generated from a client, it passes through a presentation layer to the business layer, and the data is fetched from the data layer and passed back to the business layer, which is transformed into a presentation layer and served to the client. Similarly, three layers also have some advantages, such as it has some improved performance because there is separation of concern and each layer is responsible to perform its own task. There's a decreased coupling of software component. That means each layer is separate, and if you want to change in one layer, the change will not be affected to another layer, and you can easily replace a component or replace the part of a component in a layer without actually affecting the other layers. It has also improved scalability. For example, if you want to include another layer such as a media server or any kind of other application server, you can add it in the layers. So there is an improved scalability. With advantages, there are some disadvantages such as it can cost you more than the client server application. So typically, if you have around 1,000 users and you have some higher budgets than the client server application, you can use the layer 3 layer architecture, and it is typically suitable for business or regional organizations. So there can be an N layer architecture, and is usually stand for more than 3 layers in common application. A multi-layer N-layer architecture is an expansion of 3 layer architecture in one of several different possible arrays. For example, you can replicate the function of layers. That means you can divide the function of data layer into multiple layers, or you can divide the function of presentation layer into multiple layers, or you can also divide the application or a business logic layer into more than one layer. Application and data servers are replicated in replication of functions. Servers share the total workload, so that means you can divide the application into 2 layers or 2 servers that manage the request from each user, and the share of the total workload is divided between each server. It can also be divided using the specialization of function within a layer. That means if you divide the business logic layer and the data layer and the backend layer, you can actually specialize the function that each server deals with. For example, you can specialize the special server for a business logic layer, and you can also specify another server that deals with the backend application or a legacy application from other system. So each server handles a designated part of the workload or a function. So here is a comparison of capacity, scalability, redundancy, cost. Uh, if you increase, if you want to increase the capacity of your application, or you want to increase the scalability so that you can incorporate easily the number of layers or components of your application, or if you want to have the redundant servers or part of applications, this will also be increasing your cost. You can use the number of layers for your application. So typically for a two-tier architecture that is used in the client server architecture, you can use for the local business or organizations, and it can have up to 100 users. And you can use a three-tier architecture for small e-commerce or regional business or organization that can have up to 1,000 or more users. And you can use an n-tier architecture, that is expansion of 3 layer architecture for large e-commerce business or organizations. So as you increase the number of layers, you can increase the performance, scalability, and redundancy. Uh, However, with the increase of layers, you can also increasing the cost of your application development. Similarly, like others, layer architecture also have certain benefits, such as it provides a high decoupling of software components. That means the components are divided and separated from each other at a fine level, and you can actually replace and use these components with very ease. It provides the flexibility to add, remove platforms in response to load. It can also improve the scalability of your application. It can also improve the redundancy of your components and your application. With advantages, there comes the higher costs of maintenance, design, electrical load of managing your multiple servers, and cooling of your servers. Typical application involves more than 1,000 users, and large business organizations usually prefer this kind of architecture. Want to study more, you can read the chapter 3 and 4 of Engineering book. Thank you very much. If you have any question, you can ask me in the question and answer session.